Hello SGD, this will be a compilation of videos from 2018 looking at the Egyptian goddess Seshat. She's the female counterpart of Thoth, connected to writing, record keeping, administration, and in many ways she's the superior to Thoth because she invented writing. Thoth was the person who taught it to the people. She would double check the calculations of Thoth, so being essentially the goddess of accountants. Very important in regards to, well, administration, the libraries, again, record keeping. So again, it's I've broken this compilation up into, because of a runtime, I've broken it up into two pieces. Each will be about 2 hours long. With that, I hope you enjoy this, and again, there'll be more to come. It connects to Heliopolis as well. But it has to do with this lesser known goddess, and her name is Seshat. Seshat, and she is of such vital importance and very rarely spoken of. And so classical image of her, this is actually her in what's called the stretching the cord ceremony, where they would the pharaoh would lay out the axis of the new temple and the measurements based on the new temple. Now this is her classical symbol, where we see this seven. Now there are some debate over exactly what it means, this seven-pointed star or the seven palm fronds. Some would even suggest it relates to cannabis because of the hemp rope made. She's the goddess of measurement, and she would use a hemp rope and measuring pyramids, measuring these temples, the Egyptian royal cubit, and the connection to the rope stretchers, as I will call those who would perform the measuring ceremonies. But that's her symbol. Now this is another example of her in the stretching the cord ceremony. So when a new temple was aligned, it had to be astronomically aligned, and they would perform this very important ceremony. Now this same ceremony is performed across the ancient world, aligning the axis of the temple, and there we see the seven-pointed star. Now later periods would be a five-pointed star, but also the meaning of these horns here, which connect her to the moon, and we'll get into that in a second. But so the important thing about Seshat is that she, at least in the descriptive sense, assists the pharaoh, and she is the female equivalent of Thoth, the god of knowledge, science, weights and measures, geometry, astronomy, music. The god of science is Thoth. The goddess, the female counterpart of Thoth, is Seshat, and this is her here. So again, there are some arguments over exactly what this horn is, sometimes called the horn symbol, because she's known as she of the seven stars or the lady of the horns. But what really is important about her, this is another example of the stretching the cord ceremony. This can be found from the Old Kingdom up until the Ptolemaic era. So for instance, the Edfu, but going back even in the Palermo Stone, mentions Seshat and describes the stretching the cord ceremony. So what you see there is a cord being stretched between two rods. They would hammer in these rods, and this would form the axis of the temple. She's the goddess of architecture. So unlike Thoth, she would, in at least a descriptive sense, she would physically assist the pharaoh in many, many aspects. She's of vital importance and very rarely spoken of. So again, we see just an illustration, the loop of cord, stretching the rope, and also forming the axis. Now we see the pharaoh wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, and that swirl is the crown of Upper Egypt is the rounded hat, and the swirl is the crown of Lower Egypt. So that's the stretching the cord ceremony. Now this, the primary sanctuary of Seshat, she did not have a temple dedicated to her, but her primary sanctuary was at Heliopolis, where the Ishad tree, where the name of the pharaoh, the sacred Egyptian tree of life, the sycamore, the pharaoh had his name written on the leaves, and this is a constant from the oldest period up until the late period of Egypt, and the cat being connected to her Apophis. But this the Ishad tree, of Heliopolis, being the most important, and that was where the Heliopolis was the seat of royal records. It was the seat of astronomical records. It was the seat from where the Greeks and Romans learnt their geometry and their calendar systems. This all comes from Heliopolis and is well recorded in the pyramid texts and the Coffin Text and the Book of the Dead, which come later. But the pyramid texts of its vital importance into there. And so the Ishad tree was also the Ishad tree was split in Ionu, Heliopolis. So the sun rose and would split the Ishad tree. And let's just keep going. Here's like a more a cartoonish image, but we get to see Seshat and her leopard skin clothing. Now there are some descriptions would also say that because leopard skins would be worn in the funerary priests, but also some connections to the patterns of the stars, and she was the goddess of science, and the goddess of astronomy would be included in that. We also have the Shen ring, which is an important feature, but also this measuring rod, and she's the lady of the scribes, and she counts out the years of the pharaoh. So that's another important feature. So there we see again where she has this rod with the points. She's described. She's the keeper of records. That was her role. Here's another image. Now this is backed up by actual carvings, but this is still a reason. But this box and that loop is a Egyptian scribe tool. She's the keeper of records, the lady of writing, the lady of letters, as she is called. So that was like an inkwell, and there we see it connected to the tool of the scribes, and that's who Seshat was, the lady of the scribes. It literally translates to the female scribe. So you'll often see females holding a pen, but Seshat is special because she's shown in the act of writing. And she is the female counterpart of Thoth. So we see Thoth writing, and he also has that rod with all the notches because they would count out the years of the pharaoh. The pharaoh's deeds were recorded not by Thoth, but by Seshat. She is the lady of librarians, the lady of the hall of records, or the house of life. And there again we see her classic symbol there. Now you'll see, so this is some stela. Now it's hard to make out there, but the record keepers were the priests or priestess of Seshat. So there we see the Seshat symbol as well. And another classic image, we see Seshat, and there we see the pen, the inkwell, and the scribe. That's the symbol of the scribes. She was also the goddess of architecture and of the builders, which is the symbol represented by the axe. Okay, so here's another. These are all images from the Temple of Seti I, which is around about the 13th, 14th century. But we'll get to it. She was already old by the Old Kingdom, and Thoth replaced her. So in the olden times, she was very important. But there we see the symbol of hers. This is Temple of Seti. This is a picture of her in the stretching the cord ceremony. Another in a better picture because it's you can see the star there, but she would assist the pharaoh in the stretching the cord ceremony. Thoth again is the male counterpart. There we see her. Now the star's removed, but we see her with the inkwell and the tools of the scribe, of the record keeper, and her recording the years of the pharaoh. So it was her job to record the achievements of the pharaoh, but also to count out the years allotted to him on this mortal world. So the years allotted to the goddesses also. So we see the Shen ring, and again her with a rod counting out the years of the pharaoh. Get a better idea of there. We see her image. Lots more to come on this. This is just a teaser trailer. Thoth and Seshat. Also the symbol connected to that's the Shen ring, and the cartouche where the names of the kings would be recorded was an elongated Shen ring, which means encircle or a symbol for infinity. Cartouche is the French word for cartridge because these cartouches look like a bullet, like a cartridge, like a bullet cut. So that's where the word cartouche comes from. It's actually a French word for bullet or cartridge. Neckbit with the Shen ring. okay, that's not so important for now. Thoth raising the dead, and then this is also an example of Seshat, the scribe, the writer, the recorder of records. There, her with the tools of the writer, of the scribe. So we come back to Seshat, the female scribe. She's the counterpart of Thoth. These are images from Luxor. And there we see the Shenring and the frog, like half tadpole, half frog. And both Thoth and Seshat are counting out the years for Pharaoh. But it was Seshat who like literally assisted the Pharaoh, like in a physical sense. And she was basically sort of overcome, written out, you could say. But that's her sign. These are from Karnak. Now here's well, Seshat was the daughter and consort, so she was the daughter and wife of Thoth, but that's none of my business. That's Egyptians did these things. But who was Thoth? The goddess, the god of writing, astronomy, maths, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, weights and measures, architecture, knowledge, and science in general. And Seshat was the female counterpart of this, but her role was a more, like she was the one who interacted with the pharaoh in that sense. So Seshat invented writing, and there we see an image of Seshat actually writing, not just holding it, but in the act of writing. But it was Thoth who taught writing to humanity. Now here's an interesting thing. Now this is a bit out there, but this we have the Shenring. But we see Nekhbet, again the vulture goddess, and you also see Horus holding the Shenring, which if you elongate it is a cartouche. There you can see an example of a cartouche or the cartridge. Now, they also hold rods of power. They're the god and goddess of weights and measures, architecture, astronomy, etc. Now, here we see Ishtar or Inanna holding a very, very similar symbol, which is often called the rod and the ring, which is a symbol of authority, but a symbol of measurement, tools of measure. That can also be found in Shamash holds the same, well, basically the Mesopotamian gods. This is a key feature. Again, we see that on the code of Hammurabi, weights and measures. But one of the titles of Seshat was She of 7 Points. There we get an idea. In the ancient text, the actual Egyptian text, we also have her name, her titles include the lady of letters. She is the record keeper, the keeper of records. She was the mistress of the house of books, or the mistress of the house of life. In the major temples, the house of life was the school and the library, the hall of records. She was the goddess of accounting. She was the goddess of mathematics, astronomy, geometry. The mistress of the house of the architects was one of her titles, not just in life, but also in death. She was the one who built your mansion in the afterlife. She's very important in both senses. She was the goddess of surveying. She's the equivalent of Thoth, but in a more practical sense. So Thoth was the god of those things, but she was the one who would come to earth to do these things and assist men in it. The foremost of the builders. She was the goddess of architecture, goddess of weights and measures. She's mentioned in the Book of the Dead. So there we see Thoth. He would measure the heart against the feather in the Book of the Dead. But it was Seshat, even like mentioned in the Coffin Text. She would open the portal. The door of heaven is open for you by Seshat. Now, many other aspects. So, mistress of the house of books. The house of life was the library, the school inside temples, per Ankh, the house of life. That square is the house, and the Ankh means life. Houses of life were in all the major temple complexes as well. She recorded the life of the pharaoh. That was one of her duty, or the priests or priestesses of Seshat. That was their duty. She was the goddess of accounting, so she recorded the life of the pharaoh, but also kept account of the time allotted him on earth by the gods. She also kept an account of the captives, the animals and war prizes won by the pharaoh. That was her specific duties. So again, in the stretching the cord ceremony, she was a goddess of architecture and construction. Keset Hemwe is the oldest depiction of this stretching the cord ceremony. So there we get an idea, and it's partly missing, but there we see Seshat. and the stretching the cord ceremony. She was basically the goddess of science. This practice carried up until, for instance, at Edfu and this Ptolemaic temple. But by that time, Seshat had been almost entirely overcome by Thoth, and but she's the oldest of the old gods, really. Weights and measures. The Palermo Stone is very important ancient text, which includes a king's list, but it is the oldest written description of the stretching the cord ceremony. The nylon measuring the flood, that was the priestesses of Seshat. Rope stretchers, king's list. Okay, so I'll get to that more. But so this is this goddess, so important. She was the goddess of the keepers of records. Very well written, the goddess of architecture and so many other aspects. Anyway. Hello, in this video I want to have a look at the sacred Ished tree, I-S-H-E-D, or this sacred sycamore tree, which was so important in ancient Egypt, but especially in regards to its usage from the earliest recorded period up to the middle and late and even up to the Ptolemaic period, but especially its connection to Seshat, who is the female equivalent of Thoth. But by no means a subordinate. In many ways she is more prominent, more important, but as time progressed, especially from the Old Kingdom onwards, her role become Thoth overtook her role, and so she's not as prominent as she was in the older period. But for instance, Thoth is the god of knowledge, geometry, science, astronomy, these record keeping especially, and it was Thoth who taught humanity how to write, but it was actually Seshat who was the inventor of writing. And so again, if we begin with the Old Kingdom, even pre-dynastic period, we'll see the importance of Seshat there. But as we move along, one of her main roles, such as the stretching the cord ceremony, remains, but she sort of seems to be overtaken by Thoth. But Seshat is really important, especially in regards to one of her titles was a mistress of the house of books, or the mistress of the house of life. The house of life being the school or the library connected to major temples, Heliopolis, Karnak, and others, and we'll see that. So the Per Ankh is the house of life. This was the hall of records, the house of records, and both Thoth and Seshat, especially being in regards to weights and measures, geometry, astronomy, accounting, writing, and all things academic, scientific. That was their role, and especially the importance of Seshat in this whole thing. But now we'll have a look at the Ished tree, or the tree of life, which is also an important part of this record keeping tradition of both Thoth, but especially Seshat. I'll put links in the description to a recent series, an ongoing series still, on Heliopolis in the northern suburbs of Cairo. Now there's an open air museum and a symbol obelisk still standing, and it seems to be largely forgotten. It's not one of these grand beautiful sites that is still left over, but it is of such importance to the ancient Egyptians. So it is the point at where the 9 gods of the Ennead were said to have been born, the point where the world itself was created. Its importance cannot be underestimated. In that encircled area you can see the actual natural mound, which was there and was believed in Lower Egypt believed to be the point where Atum created the Benben, or the Bennu, sorry, and the Phoenix, the Benben stone, this being the mound, the point of creation. Recent geomorphological and geophysical surveys of the area have shown that this natural mound is indeed the location which ancient writers described it as being. But it is also related to Seshat because that was one of her primary sanctuaries, and also to the Benben mound, or the point of creation, where Atum, the self-created god of the Ennead, arose from the waters, created the mound, and gave birth to Tefnut and Shu, who then went on to give birth to Geb and Nut, and then Nephthys, Horus, Isis, Osiris and Set, but it is also the point upon which the sacred Ished tree grew. So the Ished tree of Heliopolis is at least the highest, if not the most important, of these sacred trees. There were several sacred Ished, the sycamore trees, across Egypt. However, the Ished tree, the sycamore at Heliopolis, being really important in this sense, because especially in regards to keeping records and recording the name of the pharaoh, the deeds of the pharaoh, and this was done on the Ished tree by Thoth, but especially Seshat, and in the earlier period it was much more Seshat's duty, and then Thoth seems to have overtaken her. Now there's a difference between Upper and Lower Egypt, and they focus on certain features, but they have some very important things in common. But in regards to the Book of the Dead, for instance, in chapter 17, it names the Yinu, or Heliopolis, being this sacred tree where the sun split the tree in half, but also where the sacred cat, the great cat, Meow, protected the tree, this tree of life, this tree of knowledge, from Apophis, who each evening as the solar boat descended at sunset into the underworld, Apophis would attack the boat, but Apophis was always trying to destroy the order of things. It wanted to return to the singularity, before creation everything was one, a singularity. Apophis, or Apet, was a god opposed to this, and so the cat at Heliopolis, and the dots of the cat, you notice, are very similar to the leopard skin, which is also the clothing of Seshat. Next, I'd like to play of Nature TV Speakers Corner London, who is currently on a tour in Egypt, has been posting, and he is at the Temple of Karnak. But it must be Heliopolis is at least as old as the beginning of the Old Kingdom, as where places such as Karnak, Luxor, and the Ramesseum come at least 1,000 years later. But we'll be looking at the Tree of Life there, the Ished tree, and by this time, Seshat, her roles had been pretty much reduced to the stretching the cord ceremony. But now we'll play these clips. Our link will be in a description.
والنهارده انت يا رب
لا والنهارده مقابل استاذ صابر كمان
ان شاء الله نشوفكم على خير دايما يا رب ان شاء الله يا مساء. Look here. Yeah. Here is Ramses II is kneeling under the sacred tree.
Sacred tree.
Yeah, in front of Amun Khonsu and Tut or Hoti. He write his name in tree.
You write his name in the tree on the leaf.
Right. Yeah.
On the leaf. And would it be the sycamore tree?
Mm-hmm.
Sycamore tree. So we have Amun, Mut, and Khonsu.
Yeah. I think when you come last time, you didn't see this part.
No, because he said time to go for a walk for half an hour.
Oh.
Yeah, because I only had 15 minutes, and he said go for a walk for half an hour. I needed that half an hour. In the end, he didn't charge me. I said, how much should I have to do? He said, no, it's free. Because I realised I then had a little walk, so. But I saw the sacred lake. That was beautiful. See the sacred lake? Yeah, I'll just get there. Amen.
And this obelisk, we have here many obelisks. You seen obelisk before?
Yes.
Where?
In London.
Look at these beautiful scenes, guys, here, which is show us the tree of life. I think, have you heard about that before? right? The Egyptian, as we mentioned, they've been very, very superstitious. They believe that they have a tree for life, and they need to write the names on the leaves of that tree to guard eternity. So here, Ramesses II sitting on the middle of the tree, and he raises his hand, asking from the god Amun-Ra, his wife and his son, right, to give order to the human body and the ibis head that we call the god Thoth, the god of knowledge and right. They want to ask him, Ramesses II want to ask the god to give order to the god of the knowledge to write his name on the leaves of the tree. Because since he got that, he will get the eternity. You can see that the god already raised the other hand and ordered the god Thoth to write his name, right? But here, guys, I would like to show you something very strange, right? Can you come, lady? Can you sit here? Come on. Your husband, your future.
So at Karnak we saw the Persia tree, or the Ishad tree, this sycamore, where the pharaoh's name would be written into history, the keeping of the records, which was attached to Thoth, the god who taught humanity writing. However, here at the Ramesseum we have the same essential image, but we have Seshat being the one who keeps these records, who writes the pharaoh's name on this sacred Ishad tree, this the sycamore tree such as heliopolis. Now also, as a comparison, we see her depiction there with her head. You see the various descriptions of what exactly plant it is, but that comes from the later period of her. So we see that 7-leafed plant with these upside down horns in there. But if we go back to the Old Kingdom, so the in the shadow of the pyramids there are many of these graves where high officials were buried, and the slab stela, I'll put a PDF that goes through these. We see the slab stela of Weponefret, and amongst many other essential elements of Seshat, the goddess of architecture, geometry, writing, etc. There we see the earlier depiction where the 7 leaves have a horn, but with these the image there above it, which is more to come in the future in regards to Seshat. So see the later period on the left and the Old Kingdom description of Seshat there. Also in the grave complexes right next to the pyramid where these high officials were born, we have these slab stela, which were basically like a notice board of their positions. And in this one we see the stela of Seshat Second Tui, and I just got the image there as well. I'll put the link to this whole PDF because it's very detailed information, and so many of these slab stela and importance that they have there. But it's better to look at this drawing of there because we get a clearer picture. And above the head there, so Weponefret was a priest of Seshat, the keeper of royal records, and similar titles. But also here we see the older description, the older image of Seshat, the hieroglyph, let's just call it, for her. So we see on the left we see Seshat at the Luxor temple with the 7 leaves and the upside down horns. That's later period. In the Old Kingdom, going back, we have this being the hieroglyph or the image of Seshat, the lady of writing, the goddess of librarians, the goddess of architects, and so many other points. Which brings us to one of the most important pieces of evidence we have from ancient Egypt, and this is the Palermo Stone. Its exact origin is unknown. There are several pieces spread around the world, and different pieces were found actually in Lower and Upper Egypt, probably a thing of antiquities traders moving. So the exact site of it, whether it was Memphis, Heliopolis, or Upper Egypt, is unsure. But what's interesting about the Palermo Stone is that it has a king's list which has kings before Nama. So most people have probably heard of the Seti I Abydos king's list, which begins with Nama. This older king's list, which also describes the stretching the cord ceremony, includes older kings such as Scorpio, Scorpion 1. But notice that both the Nama palette has the 7 leaves, the 7-petaled flower, as does the Scorpion, King Scorpio, and even the plough that he carried, or the tool that he, but okay, that's something else, we'll get to that in the future. But Seshat, she of 7 points, and there we see the 7 points. Now one of the things, as well as recording the pharaoh's name, Seshat would record the slaves captured in war, the animals captured in war, and these other parts, which is rather nice because the Nama palette depicts these exact things. And this 7-petal rosette, pre-dynastic was used and then seems to have been reintroduced around about the 3rd dynasty, and then we have some movement through there. But that's some examples of Seshat and why she's so important. She's the goddess of the female equivalent of Thoth. Geometry, astronomy, writing, libraries are houses of life. Measurement, including the nilometer and other aspects, were all connected to this goddess Seshat, who pre-dynastic period was so important, and then seems to have faded out, although even up until the Ptolemaic period she was still essential in the stretching the cord ceremony. Thank you for watching, and I apologise for the roughness of these videos. I've been looking into Seshat and trying to compile it into a better designed, more coherent video, so I'll just be putting pieces up for the moment. But I'll put links in the description to this series I did on Heliopolis, Ben, and the importance of Heliopolis as a centre of record keeping, astronomy, geometry, science in general, because it's so important to Seshat, especially in the Nile Delta. Also put a couple other links in the description. Earlier Seshat video, also the Ishad tree and the connections to the Virgin Mary tree in Cairo, just less than a kilometre away. Hello SGD, I'm working more into Heliopolis and looking at some deeper connections to there and building on this. Well, lots of research in regards to this, but now why do I show this image? This is an image of Mary, Jesus and Joseph fleeing to Egypt. Now that brings us to, this shows the walls of Heliopolis, this most sacred of ancient centres, and what we have down here is the Virgin tree of Heliopolis. Now I'm going to put some links in the description. So there we see, that's the Virgin tree there in Heliopolis, current day Cairo. I'll drop a bunch of links in the description. We see the famous Virgin's tree, and I'll put links in there. Virgin's tree as it looked fairly recently, and it's this very sacred and ancient site for Christians, also for Muslims, because there's a mosque near there. But that brings us, firstly, let's look at the tree of life. Well, the tree of life is, you'll see it in so many different variations and perspectives, and so it's very, very important in all sorts of, especially Hermetic cult type of ways in Judaism, Christianity, even mentioned in Islam. You'll find it in the Hermetic tradition. Alchemists will be connected to it, Judaism as well. So many different formats for it, and different versions of this tree of life. Very important feature. So again, in Kabbalah, all sorts of variations of it. Also, Yggdrasil could be, that's a very similar theme with this tree of life and this geometry. For instance, this was Frata Akhet 418. Nice connections there. But tree of life, so that's current day Heliopolis Materia in Cairo, and there we see, this is on Balsam Street. Now there are 4 streets surrounding that area of the Virgin tree, the Balsam tree, but it's a sycamore. Now we'll go into that. So according to the Bible, so shortly after Jesus' birth, the Magi, the 3 wise men, Magi as in magic, so you'll find also in the Old Testament the priests of the Pharaoh were the Magi, or the magicians. Now, the 3 Magi appeared in the Bible. They followed the star birth of Jesus, and they warned Joseph and Mary, get out of town, Herod's going to kill him. And so they fled to Egypt. So from Jerusalem they fled to Egypt. Now, where did they go? Matthew 2, let me get that up a little bit. Okay, Matthew 2, 13 to 23 describes, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there till I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him. So the Magi is very strong connection to the magicians, the priests of Egypt. You'll also find in the Old Testament, for instance, Joseph and the 7 years of plenty, 7 years of drought. He became the vizier of Egypt, and he married the daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis, or On, O-N, in the Bible. You also see Heliopolis and the destruction of the obelisks of Heliopolis, which is so important, described in the Bible. So Matthew 2:13 to 23. It's also mentioned in the apocryphal texts as well. Nice connection too. But here's a screenshot. So this is a picture of some Christians on the, or maybe not even Christian, because it's for Islam as well, Mary as well. So Mary, Joseph, and Jesus fled to Egypt, and they rested under this sacred tree, Mary's tree. Now, the tree which is there now is planted from a cutting from the 1600s. The tree has been replanted in various forms, but the reason I show that picture is because we get to see, move this up a little bit, we get to see, so we can place that tree as well, and there we see the minaret, or the tower, and there we get a placement. So it's in this area, that's on Balsam Street, Al Balsam Street in Israel there, so we can get a place. I was trying to find the location of it using Google Earth, Google Maps. Maybe I was typing in the wrong name, but we get the location of it there. So Heliopolis, city of the sun, Iunu, or On, is also called in the Bible, and where the virgin tree was planted. This is, so in that square we see here, that's the open air museum of Heliopolis now, and so there are up to 48 obelisks in Heliopolis. It's because it's not a grand looking site anymore. It's completely ignored for the most part. But we have what is possibly the oldest surviving obelisk, true obelisk, and that's carved and dedicated to Senesret I. There we see a better picture of the obelisk and get its location there in this open air museum right there in the very center. This area, recent geophysical survey has confirmed the existence of the mound. That is the Benben, the gods of the Ennead, etc., according to the creation story mentioned in the Coffin Texts, Book of the Dead, so many other texts as well. This is an older painting, and again we see, so obelisks of Heliopolis were either relocated across the world. You'll find them in London, New York, Rome, Florence. But whether this was left standing from the time of Cambyses or whether it was re-erected during an earlier period, hard to pin that down. But we see the surviving obelisk of Heliopolis. Now that picture is relevant because this is a classical. Now this is not by no means an ancient picture. Neither was the previous one. But we see the obelisk there and Mary's tree. Now we get a, it's very, very close. It's about 1 kilometer away is a virgin tree, Mary's tree. So that was where Mary rested with the child as they fled from Egypt. Now, according to there's a well connected there, so they needed water, and a well miraculously appeared. There's a mosque called Mary's Well just right next door as well. But okay. The older pictures of the virgin tree, and again we see it, so that's the location of it there in regards to the tree of life. Here's another older picture of it as well. It goes back, replanted in the 1600, going back to the early Coptics. This was a sacred site of pilgrimage. Pilgrims have come here to take cuttings, to take bark, to take leaves. I'll drop links in the description, very, very, very well recorded. So, okay, I'm sure I've got more. Let me close that for a second. Okay, the Esher tree. Now, there is more because, so we have Matthew 2, chapter 13 to 23. Flee to Egypt. Again, this is a classical image. Now you see Karnak or Luxor there in the background, but the Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt, this traditional. So this is what the tree looks. Well, it was in about 2001. This is about 2010, but it has regrown since then. But why it is important, because we have the sacred Ished tree of Heliopolis. Now, there were sacred trees. Acacia would be used for coffins, would be connected to Horus, but the Ished tree, or the sycamore, there was a sacred tree, and the sacred Ished tree of Heliopolis was, well, the most sacred of sacred trees. And so as the legend goes, Mary rested underneath this tree and suckled the child. Now, according to ancient Egyptian stories, Horus was suckled by Isis underneath the shade of the Ishad tree at Heliopolis, this most sacred of sacred trees. And this is just one example of, so in the Book of the Dead we see the Ten Commandments, with references to Heliopolis. Now, Imhotep, the high priest of Heliopolis, the chief of scribes, the chief of architects, he was the high priest of Heliopolis. He presided over a 7-year famine. Joseph, who was married to the daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis according to the Old Testament, and the vizier, just like Imhotep, was the high priest of Heliopolis, architecture, scribes, and these things. Now, I'm going to get more into that this is just a one-off, because lots of stuff on Heliopolis and in regards to this as the center of record keeping, and that is especially connected to this sacred sycamore, the turquoise of the sycamore trees. So this was so important, separate from acacia. Now we have Thoth and Seshat. They were the same. He was the male version, she was the female version. They were the god and goddesses of astronomy, architecture, geometry, accounting, writing, record keeping. And on this sacred Ishad tree at Heliopolis, for instance, Seshat was the chief, was the lady of letters, the lady of the library, the lady of architecture. She recorded the pharaoh's deeds. She counted his time allotted on earth. And the sacred Ishad tree, the sycamore, which was the first tree to grow on the mound at Heliopolis, was the name of the pharaoh, and his deeds would have to be recorded on this tree. Heliopolis, and to a lesser extent Karnak, but especially Heliopolis, was the Hall of Records, was the seat of royal records. It's recorded in the Pyramid Texts, Coffin Texts, Book of the Dead. The Egyptians tell us this. And I want to go more into, because there's now a movement to try and locate the seat of records somewhere else. In the next videos, I'm going to go through these and tear it apart, essentially, because there are some very clear and exquisite records, especially in regards to Seshat and her place and her roles. So if they're going to use the Pyramid Texts, the Coffin Texts, and the Book of the Dead as a reference, well, be warned, because it's, why do they ignore these things? So Heliopolis was the center, was the seat of record keeping, the seat of royal records, the seat of astronomical records. It was the schools of geometry, philosophy, astronomy, music, and so those things connected with Thoth and with Seshat. Both of them are prior to the Old Kingdom. I'm going to go into the Palermo Stone, stretching the cord ceremony. Very long amount of records, but this is a one-off. The Tree of Life, the Tree of Record Keeping, the Tree of Creation, born on the mound from where Atum created, and the gods were born, and the point of creation in Lower Egypt, the land of the pyramids, the land of the Sphinx. Heliopolis was the center. Now, for instance, in the Book of the Dead, chapter 17, we see these depictions. The great cat beside whom the Eshed tree was split in Unu, that's Heliopolis, is Ra himself, called Cat when Sia said to him, it is how he is and what he has done. His name is become Cat or Mao. Meow. Now, these are many depictions of it, but the cat of Heliopolis defends the Ishad tree, the sacred tree, from Apophis. This here is Apophis, so the sacred cat. The cat of Heliopolis, he defends from Apophis or Apet. And so what you'll see other descriptions. So on the solar bark, the solar boat, each night, beginning with Khepri, the scarab-faced god, the god of the morning sun, Horus or Ra, the god of the midday sun, and Atum, the god of the setting sun. The boat would set in the underworld, and each night Apophis, Apophis was he believed in a pure order, so creation caused duality and conflict and chaos in a sense. Apophis wanted pure order and he disliked creation, and so each night he would attack the solar boat as it passed into the underworld. Each night it would have to be defended. This record, this life, was defended by the great cat of Heliopolis, Mao, and so this is a breed of cat called the Mao, originating in Egypt, and we also notice a pattern on there. We're going to get into more in there. It's a bit of onomatopoeia because cats go meow, and that's so another spelling is M-Y-W, meow, as well. So there's now this breed of cat, when exactly it was named, but there is a nice, why did the ancient Egyptians call it meow? Well, it's the sacred cat of Heliopolis and connected to Seshat as well. It's also interesting to note the sacred Ishad tree, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. All knowledge was encoded in this tree. It was the story of creation, and the past, present, future was embedded in this tree. And the serpent, the tree of knowledge, is also a Christian extension, or let's not say extension, at least a curious coincidence amongst us, the Book of the Dead and these other texts in biblical texts as well. But you also, as we're going to go into it in other episodes, I'm going to do it more scripted and detailed, and look into these facts, these well-recorded Egyptian facts, rather than relying on Edgar Cayce, essentially, which is not a source. Anyway, hope you enjoyed Tree of Life. Have a good Hello, this will be part 3 in this series, and so far the videos are a little bit ad hoc as I'm making them, but we'll be looking again more at this important goddess Seshat. And you can see, well, firstly above her head you see that now the exact meaning of that emblem, we'll discuss that a little bit more, but her primary role was many-fold. So she was the goddess of writing. She invented writing. Thoth taught it to humanity, but she was the inventor of it. She's the goddess of record keeping and librarians, the goddess of accounting and accountants, maths, geometry, measuring, survey, architecture. She is the female equivalent of Thoth, essentially the goddess of science and knowledge and analytical thinking as well, some would describe, as opposed, so a very practical goddess, very much involved in very practical scientific things, and that's a classic image of her. We'll be looking at that closely, but now I'll be looking at the Temple of Seti I in Abydos around about the 13th century BC. It's in Upper Egypt, and it is in this later period, so it's over 1,000 years away from the Old Kingdom. Temple of Seti, Abydos, that's where the Osirion is, but also where the famous King's List is. And some screenshots, and this video is from Ray Tours Egypt Part 7, Abydos and the Temple of Seti I. Links will be in the description. He's currently in Egypt, and he's going all across these wonderful temples and taking longer videos, just really showing them in very nice detail. So if you're interested in Heliopolis, Memphis, Karnak, Luxor and these other places, well, this is from Seti I. And there we have, at the doorway, we have Seshat there. So in her hand, we'll get a better image of it later, but what she's the goddess of writing, the goddess of record keeping, and she's connected to this emblem, the symbol of the writer's tool, which is more of a pictograph in a way, but also a hieroglyph, but that's the tool of the writer. Seshat invented writing, Thoth taught it to humanity. Seshat is special that she's not only shown holding the tools of writing, but she's also depicted actually doing the writing and the record keeping. She assisted the pharaoh in a physical sense, let's say, as where Thoth was more separate, but amongst her many titles, Seshat was the Lady of Letters, the keeper of, the mistress of the House of Life, or the House of the Books. She was literally the goddess of librarians and records, and the houses of life, or the houses of books, were a cross between a library and a school. So she was Egyptian schooling. She was very important in that sense. Also, one of her titles is She of 7 Points. So whether it's a palm frond or whether it was the hemp plant, and both of them have very nice connections. We'll go into them more, but that's one of the easiest ways to firstly recognize her when she is depicted, but there also is for the priest of Seshat will have that pictograph as well as the more typical hieroglyphs, which are not strict pictographic descriptions. It's a little bit more phonetic anyway, separate topic. So here we also see Seshat stretching the cord. Now there you can see the seven symbol above her head and the upside down horns. But in what she is doing here is part of what's called the stretching the cord ceremony. We'll get a better picture of it. But when temples were set up, they would have to be aligned. So all the pyramids, for instance, are aligned to the north. So the measurement system, but also the alignment of your temple was the ground plan was the first thing that needed to be done. And it would be Seshat who would assist the pharaoh in this ceremony. Now, of course, there were more priests or priestesses involved in the actual ceremony, the actual process of finding that alignment, but there was this ceremony, this ritual, which the pharaoh at least would be depicted with the goddess Seshat finding the alignment of that temple, and there they are hammering 2 pegs into the ground which would find this alignment. Now the stretching the cord ceremony is also connected to the pole star. We'll get into, because stretching the cord in itself involves on its own, but she's the goddess of surveying. So the temples or the pyramids, the alignment there, very important. She's also the foremost of the builders, both in life and in death. She would build your house in that sense. And there's just like an illustration, but there we can see again a broader picture of stretching the cord ceremony. And this goes from the Old Kingdom. So on the right hand side we can see the oldest pictorial description of a stretching the cord ceremony, right up until the Ptolemaic era and the Temple of Edfu, the Greek era when the Greeks ruled over Egypt. But this was a continuum throughout, so that's a very important. It connects geometry, astronomy, surveying, and construction. And the sciences, of course, writing and record keeping. These other roles that she has. Now, there we see Thoth, the god of knowledge, the equivalent of Hermes. You can even Hermes Trismegistus and Thoth are basically interchangeable, but he has the same role. Now, in the later period, he took over this almost completely, but even as we saw in the Ptolemaic era, Seshat was still important in the stretching the cord ceremony. But in the Old Kingdom and pre-dynastic, references to both Thoth and her are present, but also they're very much stronger. So yes, Seshat seems to have been written out, but still in the temple of Seti I, Abydos, another depiction of Seshat there. Now the star is slightly removed, but we see her again with this notched rod where she is counting out, that she is the accountant. One of her duties was to count out the years of a pharaoh, to record his speeches, to keep his records. But again we see her, always attached with her is that the scribe's tool, like a small inkwell, a reed pen, and either a pot or a small bag to hold the material to make the ink. Very close to it, still in the entrance, in the main hall entrance to Temple of Seti I, there we see another description of Seshat, and again with this notched rod, and again she's holding in her left hand, we see again that same, the scribe's tool. Seshat translates to she who scribes, or the female scribe. And we get it close. So very, very important. So the priests of Seshat, so even in the cemetery next to the pyramids, we see the burials of the high officials. They would have these slab stela, which would list so some would be generals, but one of the highest position, if not the highest position, was the keeper of the king's record. And we see that, I'll get into more of that in future episodes, but yeah, the keeper of the records, the accountant, was right beneath the pharaoh. For instance, Imhotep. Here we see Seshat and Thoth together. She's the female counterpart of Thoth. And if you go back in time, so the Seti, the first here temple, Ramesseum, Karnak, Luxor, they're around about 13 to 1500 BC, but there's plenty of evidence of her, again, in the oldest recorded periods. And so Thoth, god of writing, astronomy, math, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, include alchemy in that, weights and measures, architecture, knowledge and science in general. Seshat was the female counterpart of Thoth. Further inside the temple of Seti I here at Abydos, again now we can see Thoth there, and as we'll pan over again, we'll see another depiction of Seshat once again, and there we can see again she's in the writing. She's holding the writer's tool again in her left hand. Now it's just been inverted, and also the 7-pointed star. But in her right hand, she is like literally writing. She's the goddess of hieroglyphs. So this is from Nature TV, Speakers Corner London. The channel link will be in the description to his video. And now this is a drawing, but this is taken. There are literal carvings of this, and now we'll look at another. This is from Half a Sheep channel. He also visited the temple of Seti I, which is where the Osirion is as well. But he also has another interesting piece of video, and here we see it here. Now again, it must be mentioned in the old text, Nephthys and Seshat are connected, so there can be some confusion between the two. But again, she's holding this rod. We see in her left hand once more she's holding the writer's tool, and in her right hand she's physically writing. There we see the tools of the scribe. And curiously here she holds two rods, and we'll get an idea of that because the Shen ring and the symbol of Heket is an important one, and we'll break that down a little bit now. Here we see Seshat seated, but we can compare it to this illustration which was taken from a tomb wall or from a temple wall. I'm not exactly sure where, but these other emblems we'll explore. But you can also you already see the trace of the 7 points above her head, the rod that she carries. She's in the act of writing, and again with her left hand she holds the instruments, but with her right hand she writes. And there you can see in her hand with the scribe's tool, the writer's tool, which is an inkwell, a container of ink, but also the reed from which to write. We'll look at it again a little close, but she's also holding two rods here, and that's an interesting point to connect as well, especially with the papyrus versus the lotus and the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. So it's a bit hard to tell, but you can, especially when you get down to the bottom, you can see here that she has two Shen rings. There are two rods next to one another, and that figure there is the goddess Heket. But in here, this particular depiction in Abydos, Temple of Seti I, we see two of these half tadpole, half frogs. Usually it's only one, but the importance of two rods is again connected to Thoth, because elsewhere in Temple of Seti I in Abydos we see Thoth feeding the pharaoh the ankh, the life, but he's also holding two rods, and one of them, they're snakes, but one has the crown of Lower Egypt and one has the crown of Upper Egypt. And also elsewhere you'll see, but the lotus represents Upper Egypt and the papyrus Lower Egypt. But what they're depicting there is Heket, this goddess of fertility. For instance, next to the, in inverted commas, air quotes, the light bulb in the Temple of Hathor, she holds knives because she protected pregnant women. Pregnant women would have a blade and they would put a spell on it, and that would protect them from evil. But it can be confusing, but when you see an image of a frog, tadpole turning to a frog, it becomes a little bit more clear that this is actually Heket, this goddess of fertility, also of protection, breathing life into new items, and especially important in Upper Egypt because there is a big distinction. Now, for instance, that's Heket next to the air quotes light bulb, holding the blades, and that's so she can give life. She can take life, but there was this practice where pregnant women would have a literal blade, but they would carve a spell on it to protect them from evil forces. So these are Thoth and Seshat at the Temple of Luxor, and there we can see that they both have the Shen ring and the Heket symbol there above it as well, but only carrying a single rod together, Upper and Lower Egypt. But as a comparison between the Heket symbol, sometimes it's a fully grown frog, sometimes she's represented as a human form, but also has this transformational between the tadpole and the frog. So there's a a little bit more on Seshat. I'll be looking at the stretching the cord ceremony, astronomical connections, pyramid alignments, temple alignments in the future. But yeah, goddess of astronomy, math, geometry, weights and measures, science, knowledge in general. So with that, hope you enjoy. Hello SGD, and in this video I want to carry on a little bit more and look at this very important goddess Seshat, who over time from the prior to the Old Kingdom and up to the Late Kingdom, up to the Ptolemaic era was still there, but her position was slowly diminished. But the further you go back in time, the more her importance. And so for instance, Seshat is essentially the female counterpart of Thoth. Thoth was connected to writing, astronomy, maths, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, weights and measures, architecture, knowledge, and science in general. Seshat was either his equal or his superior in many ways, and again her position was lost in time. For instance, Thoth is famous. He taught writing to humanity, but Seshat was the inventor of writing, and that alone puts her importance above Thoth in so many ways. And over time she was essentially erased except for a few special roles. But in this video I'll be looking at, I'll just be collectively calling it the Palermo Stone. On the left we see what is the Palermo Stone, but there are actually multiple pieces of this stone. Its provenance is it's difficult to trace the exact location of it, because in the late 1800s, when most of the pieces were found somewhere in what we call Upper Egypt, somewhere in Lower Egypt, but the nature of the antiquities trade being a little bit nefarious, so bits would be moved around. If someone, I want a piece from Thebes, no worries, I've got it, my cousin has one, and you just get a piece from somewhere else and you say it was from Thebes. But anyway, these pieces of the Palermo Stone, there are portions of it left, but what is left is quite interesting. And so to begin with, especially if you've looked into Egypt, you've no doubt heard of the King's List at Abydos, or the Temple of Seti I. That seems to be the most famous one, and that's often used. There are problems with this because it's 13th century BC. The Turin List, essentially of the same period. Now both Abydos King's List, the Turin's King List, and Manetho in the 4th century BC talk about the Tepi, the before time. But just sticking with the King's List, what we have, for instance, in the Abydos King's List at at Temple of Seti I, Menes is the first listed king of these 76. Several are missing, several known kings are missing, but Menes is said to be the first, and that's often described as being King Nama. So we have this famous Nama palette, which is usually said to be the first king of United Egypt, uniting the Upper and Lower Egypt and beginning Egyptian civilization. Well, there are big holes in that, because the hieroglyphs were already pretty well established, and that Upper Egypt was a large area, and any administration that could control Upper and Lower Egypt was not just civilization, was highly developed to be able to control those. But the Royal Annals, or the Palermo Stone, also contains a king's list, and it separates Menes and Nama, has separate kings, and also has several listed kings prior to King Nama or Menes, or the dynastic period. And whether the Palermo Stone was carved later from an earlier copy or was original to this very early period, because the King's List ends with King Unas, the famous king for the pyramid texts, for instance. But now if we just highlight the beginning of the first dynasty and those kings prior, we see that in the Palermo Stone, which either, if it was a copy of an older document or an original one, has Menes and Nama, has separate kings. Also it has these kings prior to them. So there we see the Nama palette. But who we have prior to Nama, we have King Scorpion. Now if you look at the implement he's carrying and the Selk, the scorpion god, there's hieroglyphs there as well, showing that the language and civilization and some sophistication in administration had already been well developed. Also the seven petal rosette. But prior to King Scorpio, we also have King Ka, and objects found in regards to him. So this is still highly debated. So For instance, Abydos, King's List, Manetho, Turin Canon have the before time. Anyway, that's a whole issue. But we have these earlier kings in these earlier documents. But now, if we look at this, is a close-up of the Palermo Stone. It's a very interesting document in that sense for many reasons. One of the oldest documents as well. It includes references to the Sed festival, references to the stretching the cord ceremony, and also some important features. Now, for instance, there I've highlighted in yellow, each one of those symbols represents a year. That's a stripped palm frond, which is connected to several gods, but especially to Thoth, and more importantly, it's connected to Seshat. It's a symbol of 1 year. And I'll put links in the description. So, for instance, Gardner's book on hieroglyphs is still a classic reference book, even though it was written over 150 years ago, I think, but it's still a classic reference text, and it shows that this palm frond represents 1 year. Variations on this hieroglyph are also variations on time. You can see the connection of a palm frond. Again, I'll put a link to in the description to Egyptian grammar. You can get it as a free PDF and download, but there we see Gardner's listings of this palm frond and variations on time, and the most important one is the one there at the top, the palm branch or palm panicle references to time. So there we see again just a combination of hieroglyphs. The scarab with a New Year request, for instance, these are all in Gardner's, and no one, even whether mainstream or alternative, they all use Gardner as a reference. So there you go. Now, there we see three version, like a picture, but also two carved images, and also with Thoth. Now you don't get the full picture in all of them, but there you do, at least in the diagram and in the middle right, you get the idea of this bent palm frond as a symbol. And that's an important one because both Thoth and Seshat are especially connected to weights, measures, and accountants as well. That was one of their core influence. And so again, we see a reference to this stripped palm frond. You'll also notice the Shen ring and the tadpole symbol, which represents 100,000 as well. So there are nice little number reflections connected in there. Here's the ebony label of Den, of important pharaoh. There we see the palm frond highlighted there as well, representing a year, but also shows him in the Sed festival, which was where the pharaoh would have to run around the compound to that was part of a ceremony to show his dominion over there. Could go into that, but we'll get into more in other episodes. Here's just I just got a down the road palm tree. That's your palm. You strip it off, and what you have is all these little bits and pieces on there, which is a primitive tally stick system. So just like you see the classic image of Seshat, she counts out the years of the pharaoh. She's his accountant in all sorts of things, and this is a primitive system. But a very effective system. So here we see a tally stick, and there you can see an image. You would carve notches, and you could split the tally stick in half, and then because of erratic nature, it was like a anti-counterfeiting mechanism, because the stick would fit back together. If it fit perfectly, that was that's how they used to record money. It was like an old bank account. You split the stick. If the stick fits back together, therefore it's an honest one. Now there are arguments over what this symbol of Seshat. So on the left we see the later period, and then in the middle that's the Old Kingdom sign for Seshat. Now, is it a palm frond like that, where we can see the little notches as well as a primitive counting mechanism? There are also some who would suggest that it represents a plant which I won't name because you get striked for some reason, but it could be that as well. I'd probably think to this one because Seshat was also connected to survey and measure, just like Thoth, but earlier references, whether it's the pyramid text, Coffin Texts, Book of the Dead, as also these Palermo stones and these other ancient references. But hemp rope was the rope of choice and standard, and of course can't talk about that, so it still carries with us his stigma to this day. Okay, returning to the Palermo stone and this symbol. So each one of those boxes, let's just call them, has this symbol of the palm frond, the palm branch representing 1 year. And as we saw, the symbol, which is not exclusive to Seshat, but these gods or goddesses connected to measurement, such as Thoth, or connected to the flood cycle, but we see that hieroglyph and the strip palm frond, which again is a very convenient, simple tally stick system. So the Palermo Stone, more clearly, just as a comparison, the palm frond, and just a close-up, you can get to see those boxes, because there's a small rectangle underneath each one of those, and that is another reference to the year. So there I've highlighted it. Each one of these boxes represents 1 year, but they write down the measurement of the flood. So the symbol of fingers, palms and inches is represented in there. Fingers, palm and cubits, ancient Egyptian cubits. So there you get a close-up of it, and you see how the flood is of 1 palm, 3 cubits, or 2 fingers, 6 palm and 3 cubits, the Nile flood. This was a very, very important measure, because with that they could get a good idea of how good the harvest or how bad the harvest would be. And the 3 seasons of Egypt was Arket, Peret and Shemu, the flood, the growing season and the harvest season. This was their calendar system, and this symbol Arket, which I've mentioned in earlier videos, nice references to the Ouroboros there, this cycle of time. But the flood being so important, literally the heartbeat of Egypt. After 1970, the flood stopped because of the High Aswan Dam. Years before that, there had been various flood mitigation schemes, but it's so important, connected, because Seshat was the goddess of surveying. So after each flood, land would be lost or gained, and the surveyors would go out, measure the land, and their taxes would be adjusted accordingly. As the goddess of weights and measures, it was the priests, but earlier references have the priestesses of Seshat being the ones who took the measure of the Nile flood. Now, along the whole length of the Nile, you have what are called Nilometers, where the river height would be marked, and the height of the flood being very important, because if it was too high, it would be disastrous. If it was too low, it would be disastrous. And so this was a good predictor of the coming year. And so, if it was too high, it would wash away. There'd be bad harvest. If it was too low, there'd be a drought, bad harvest. That was the heartbeat, and also, again, a very good predictor of economic activity. During that time, prior to the High Aswan Dam and earlier flood mitigation schemes, the flood would come right up to the base of the pyramids. That's why you have these causeways going down to these harbours as well. This was happening, but long before ancient changes in the Nile. The flood come up to these harbour systems, but also you see temples would be flooded over at that time. Now, Temple of Karnak, for instance, surrounded by enclosure walls, and there was a big gate there. And next I'll play a clip from Ray Tor's Egypt, link in a description, talking about Karnak and these enclosure walls, and an interesting happening.
This way, guys, I'm going to show you the most interesting scenes in that area. Then after that, I'll take you to 2 more places, then give you free time to take this.
You're saying the earthquake, so these are fallen, you think?
No, not the earthquake here. Yeah. Actually, the around 1887, the French people been here, right? And at that time, they found that there are salt appear in the wall that came from the floor down, right, in the columns, and they get a white color. So they open the gate of the temple, and they allow to the flood of the water to enter the temple to clean the temple.
Okay, yeah.
At that year, it's been had a high flood. That's damaged many columns here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but these columns are restored.
Oh, restored,
yeah. That part, that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it there. Yeah.
So the enclosure walls around Karnak and these other major temples were also flood protection systems. I could bring in Heliopolis, but all other places as well. And the damage which could be done to stone with the salt and water in these cycles would be quite large, especially over time. One flood and after a build-up of salt, well, as we saw there in Karnak. But back to the Palermo Stone, and each one of these boxes representing a year. I'll put some links to papers in the description. Gardner and his hieroglyphs, Wainwright and talking about Seshat, and a few others in regards to the Palermo Stone. But there we see in these boxes, because there are references to the said festival, but also to what's this, the birth of Seshat. Now, I'll go in future episodes into more details, but what we see when you highlight these boxes, and now highlighted in blue, there we see the symbol of Seshat. This is the old king, the very old symbol of Seshat when her role was much more dominant. So, for instance, in the pyramid text from Unis, yeah, she's right up there. As time progresses, she, except for the stretching the cord ceremony in the late kingdom up to the Ptolemaic era, she becomes less and less important. But there's just a picture of from Wainwright showing the variations of Shet. Now these are the old descriptions of Seshat. The one with the upturned bull, that's from about the from about the Middle Kingdom to the Late Kingdom. So there on the left-hand side we see Seshat at Luxor, approximately 1400 BC, the construction of those statues there, and she's there behind. But we see her with the 7 fronds or 7 leaves above, and these upside-down horns. But we see a slab stealer here. So, for instance, of Seshat Tiyu, but it's easier to see there with the etching of the diagram, but even her name Seshat. So the scribes, male and female, were the high-ranking officials, and they were priests amongst other titles, but they would also have this title of the overseer of the scribes, or the great overseer, and they'll have the emblem of either the tools of the scribe, which are just inseparable from the symbols of Seshat. So, for instance, the stealer of weapon effort there, on the far right column we see the scribe's symbol, and underneath the lioness with her tail up in the air, what we have is the symbol of Seshat as well. But also her titles as, his titles as the overseer of the scribes. He was a high official. That's why he was buried in the Western ceremony. These slab stealer and these very, very high officials who would sometimes go on to become the pharaoh. But again, we see the old description of Seshat there, Old Kingdom, as opposed to the Middle and Late Kingdom Ptolemaic descriptions of Seshat with the upside down horns there. Especially when you, again, in future episodes I'll go more into this, because the stretching the cord ceremony is essential in aligning your temples. It was very, very important. It's mentioned in the Palermo Stone. Again, these oldest documents from Egypt, very important there. And I showed earlier a screenshot from Gardner, but again we're going pre-dynastic now, or early dynastic, and what we have is in both Nama and in King Scorpio, or Scorpio 2, we have this 7-petal rosette, which is a early, just again to show the earlier representation, but also the scorpion and Selk, the scorpion god, and those connections. Now, what's he holding? What's Scorpio holding in his hands? Well, that's actually, along with the bull's leg, that's the northern constellation. That's the North Star symbol as well, which is where in the stretching the cord ceremony they had to align. So they'd stretch the cord and they will align it to the north. All the pyramids are aligned to the north. All these, well, so, it's hard. It's with a few exceptions, everything is aligned to the north, or has a beginning point of aligned to the north, and this is connected to Seshat, the stretching the cord ceremony. I'll go into more detail because there's some very, very interesting connections which is essentially overlooked. But this earlier symbol of Seshat through to the later period, but she of 7 points. There's a lot to be said about Seshat. So we have her older symbols, and then through to on the right hand side we see the Old Kingdom versions, on the left hand side the later development of her symbol. But in these, whether it's the pyramid text or for instance the Palermo Stone, these essentially primary sources of the Old Kingdom, where they're also discussing about the kings before Nama or Menes. But more to come on this. This again was just a bit of a ad hoc thrown together presentation in that sense, but links will be in the description to some important papers in regards to the Palermo Stone and Seshat, and in the future I'll be looking more in depth in regards to the stretching the cord ceremony, has described in the the most ancient surviving records. But we can also see here, we see the stretching the cord ceremony. Seshat assists the pharaoh, so Thoth was there, but it was Seshat who did the physical work. So, for instance, Thoth would take account, and then Seshat would double check his work. She was the better in many senses in regards to that. But the stretching the cord ceremony, whether it's in these very old texts or even up to, for instance, the Edfu texts and the Ptolemaic era, she remained the most important goddess in the stretching the cord ceremony, aligning things to north, which would apply to all of the pyramids and essentially all of the major temples and mastaba and also many other things. So let's not forget Seshat. I'm all about Seshat at the moment. Anyway, more to come on this, especially stretching the cord, because that's going to raise some really important questions. And hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 5 of the series on Seshat, and just a quick review. So who was she? She was a very important goddess to do with accounting, geometry, astronomy, math, writing, essentially the goddess of the sciences or the academic scholarly works, record keeping. Now, for instance, see her with a palm front, she counted out the years of the pharaoh, all sorts of accounting, science just in general, and that's her symbol there now. This is from Temple Seti the First at Abydos. We see Seshat with Thoth. She's the female counterpart of Thoth, and as time went on, her role was eventually diminished, and essentially many of her roles was usurped by Thoth. But the further you go back, you find that she's actually not, if not the equal, the superior in many ways. So traditionally, Thoth is associated with writing. He taught writing to people. It was actually Seshat who invented it. Astronomy, maths, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, weights and measures, architecture, knowledge, science in general, record keeping. Well, it's actually Seshat who was the primary one, the main one, in many ways. So geometry. She has many titles in the very old texts, and so mistress of the house of the architects, goddess of surveying, the mistress of the house of life, record keeping, librarians, foremost of the builders. So both in life, but also in the afterworld, netherworld, or would be I'm not sure the term. She'd also make your mansion in the afterlife as well. So weights and measures being connected to her. What's most important is this, what's called stretching the cord ceremony, where Seshat and the pharaoh, they bang 2 stakes into the ground with a loop of rope. This establishes not just the axis of the construction, but also the units of measurement, an important feature in regard to this as well. Very similar, Shenring, I mentioned that earlier, the rod and the ring, ancient systems, measurements and surveying tools. This would align it to north, so we'll cover that, but the importance of north and Seshat and this stretching the cord ceremony in the architecture. This is the oldest known surviving picture of a stretching the cord ceremony. It goes back to very, very old Cassicamway, and part of it is missing. Now, however, there are also written descriptions of it, but that's as a picture. Now you still get an idea of Seshat stretching the cord ceremony. So the Palermo Stone, for instance, lists various stretching the cord ceremony and connects them to Seshat. So all that piece is missing. We can be very confident that it's Seshat, because it's written in the Palermo Stone. Okay, so let's do a timeline. And we'll begin with, year 0. Let's note year 0. It's like either 1 BC or 1 AD, but the Ptolemaic period. Around about the year 30 BC, Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire. Prior to that was what was the Ptolemaic period, and that comes as basically the Greek rulers of Egypt. So Alexander the Great conquered the known world, and when he died, his empire was split up. His generals each were granted a region, and Ptolemy, one of his generals, become the the king of Egypt, and that's where Ptolemaic comes from. One of his descendants was the famous Cleopatra, as in Anthony and Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs of Egypt, kings, queens of Egypt. Across Lower and Upper Egypt, there are several depictions of Alexander the Great being crowned as pharaoh, and that's an important feature because one of the powers of Egypt was even when the foreign rulers come in, they would become Egyptian, and they didn't bring in their own culture, religion, architecture. They became Egyptian, and so there you see, rather than a Hellenistic version, there's Alexander, and there's several other ones of him in these ceremonies across Egypt. But also, for instance, Com Ombo is one example. This is actually Ptolemaic era. This was built during the Ptolemies period. It has a famous calendar there as well. Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where the light bulbs are, but also the Dendera zodiac. That is also built during the Ptolemaic period, just one of them, and also includes the Seshat and the Pharaoh and the stretching the cord ceremony. Temple of Horus at Edfu, again Ptolemaic, and I think just important because even just the established Egyptian history covers 3,000 years, so I think it's important to highlight that it covers a long period and that these other aspects were actually from much later. So the Parthenon had already been built by the time the Edfu, Com Ombo, and these other temples have been built, but at Temple of Horus Edfu, we have the Pharaoh and Seshat stretching the cord ceremony. We also have what's called the Edfu texts, which describe the stretching the cord ceremony and how important it was. And so a lot of these Egyptian temples are actually Greek or Roman era constructions. But the stretching the cord ceremony, Seshat, and this is her symbol of the later period. We'll get to this because it changed over time, but what you have is this, either 7 leaves or 7 petals, depending, and the upside down horns. Okay, so Seshat. Okay, now prior to that you had the Persian conquest, Cambyses. Unlike other foreign rulers, Cambyses was no fan of Egyptian culture. He went out of his way to destroy sacred sites, destroy the important tombs, monuments, kill the sacred bull, and so the Persians went out of their way to destroy Egyptian culture. Now, prior to the Persian conquest, that's the Sate era, or the late dynastic period, a recent statue was found. It originally thought to be Ramses because of the size, but it was actually turned out to be Psamtik I, and it's the last, or one of the last, but last known of these colossal stoneworking statues. So that's only around about 650 BC. Prior to that, what you had was the Kushite rule. The Kushites were foreigners, but they were still very They were from the Nubians, or modern Sudan. Their religion, etc., was very similar to Egypt already. So although they were technically foreign rulers because they were above the cataracts, they were still very Egyptian, and even so the Nubian Book of the Dead is slightly different. However, they incorporated heliopolis into it, which is way up here in Lower Egypt. So again, they incorporated Egyptian culture, respected it, and even though they had their own slight variations on these things, but that's just one of these foreign rulers. Now, prior to that, around about the year 1170 BC, you have what's called the Bronze Age collapse. So at that point, and we're moving backwards in time, so we'll get to the Battle of Kadesh, but at that time, the Hittites and the Egyptians had peace treaties, trade deals going on, lots and lots of trade moved between them. Egyptian rulers were writing letters to the Hittites. How's the mother? How's the father? Heard your kid broke his leg. Hope all is well. Did you get the perfume I sent you? Thanks for that shipment of dried fruit, etc., etc. Even Hammurabi. So you have these very personal letters. You have and not just a few, many of them across this entire region, including business receipts, trade deals, and very personal letters as well. So up to this point, the history is it's not just relying on some Egyptian text or some Hittite text. Across that whole region, all the people that are telling the same story. We can be and we can be very confident of that history to that point, because everyone's backing each other up on that. There's a card anyway. That's just an illustration of it, but that's the Battle of the Nile Delta, where the sea peoples were defeated in one particular battle. But whether the Bronze Age collapse was because of the sea peoples in these invasions, and now the sea peoples were moving on land as much as they were moving on the sea, so that's the term that's often given to them. But most of the army was travelling on land, and even the records, so the Great Harris Papyrus also describes them carrying their possessions on carts, and they brought their wives and children with them. It wasn't just like a invasion army; it was a mass migration in that sense. Now, whether the Bronze Age collapse was because of these armies moving around, environmental factors, or socio-political events, Eric Klein has written on this, lots of great lectures he has available on YouTube in regards to this. And as he says, it probably was a 1-2-3 punch rather than any one single factor, but a combination of all of these leading to the Bronze Age collapse. There was a collapse in trade, major construction projects for a couple centuries all stopped. Now, prior to the Bronze Age collapse, we get to Ramses the Great. These are some of the statues at Abu Simbel. Very egotistical, let's just say. He really liked stamping. So not only did he stamp his name, so there are many old hieroglyphs and writings, and then Ramses stamped his name on top, but underneath you can still see the old one. But also many of his works, original works as well, and are just monumental. Now this is a statue of Ramses. This is just one of them. It's actually not the biggest one, but just to get an idea of the colossal works. And so it was actually during the New Kingdom that the largest stones moved over. The Colossi of Memnon, for instance, were all in this New Kingdom period. So yeah, awesome stonework, massive weights, moved massive distances, but they are in this period of the New Kingdom. Now, if you want to see, so trilithons of Baalbek, they're rectangular blocks of limestone. Okay, this is Ozymandias Colossus by Ramses II. This weighed more than the heaviest trilithon at Baalbek, and it was a statue, and it was upright. So the trilithons are laying on their side. They're only moved half a mile, either essentially across, depending on where they come from, the trilithons come from the quarry. It was either one fraction of a degree uphill or a couple of degrees downhill, and half a mile. Ozymandias Colossus was a statue lifted upright, so it was much higher than it was wide, and it weighed more than all of them, and it was a beautifully carved statue. Ozymandias is the Greek pronunciation of Ramses II's throne name, and there's also that famous poem, which is based on there's a bit of some poetic license in the poem, of course, but he's describing this Ozymandias collection. Look on my works, you mighty in despair. Alright, so now Ramses II, he won the Battle of Kadesh. So I already mentioned previous, so moving backwards, that after Ramses, the Egyptians and the Hittites were writing letters to each other, sending each other gifts, lots and lots of trade going on. But this peace between the Hittites and the Egyptians began with what's called the Battle of Kadesh, which was won by Ramses II. All over Egypt, many temples, you'll see this picture. That's Ramses and celebrating the Battle of Kadesh victory. And there are also, again, many this is a peace treaty, and one of the example of these documents. So the peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians. All this history is like very well recorded and cross-referenced. All the peoples in that area, they write letters to each other, and they wrote, so when they wrote a letter, he had to have existed at the same time as that person to have written that letter, or to have sent a business receipt, or a trade deal, or a peace treaty. So all this is very, very well established. Very, very well established. Father of Ramses II was Seti I, Temple of Seti I at Abydos, where you have his famous kings list. And this was around about the same time as the Turin canon. And this This is in the New Kingdom, which is an important feature. So, but what you have is Seti I with his son Ramses II. Now, what's also interesting is the Temple of Seti I. You have many depictions of Seshat, and there we see. So this is a comparison with the Ptolemaic era one. You see the upturned horn, the upside down horns, but also there's a stretching the cord ceremony carving in there. Now, in the screenshot, I couldn't quite grab all of it, but we get a view above her head, and there we get it. The symbol of Seshat is slightly bit different there, because what we have in the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, we have both the new symbol of Seshat and the old symbol of Seshat. This is from the Old Kingdom, the Stello of Weponefret, and you also find it Palermo Stone. So this is like an interesting point in history, and it's pretty much a period where the new symbol of Seshat emerges, and the Temple of Seti I, we see the old and the new there. So several kings in the New Kingdom era, but the important one, probably should mention Tutmosis as well, but let's just for Hatshepsut. So, for instance, at Karnak and these mighty obelisks, the majority of them again were from this New Kingdom period. So the obelisks of Hatshepsut, Tutmosis, and others. So the single great pieces of stone, if you want to find in Egypt, were moved in the New Kingdom. And so she was a female pharaoh, and she was one of those pharaohs who's not mentioned by Seti I, and these are written out of the history in many ways, and her name often defiled, destroyed, or some cases. For instance, at Karnak, Tutmosis built a wall, which is to hide the name of Hatshepsut and her obelisk. But what we also have is Hatshepsut shown there as the king, doing the stretching the cord ceremony, and notice Hatshepsut, the symbol now, is the Old Kingdom, or the very old version of it. Prior to, from Seti I onwards, we have Seshat shown this way. Prior to that, that's the symbol of Seshat. Get a close up. Okay, also around about the time of the New Kingdom is where the Book of the Dead comes to the fore, also called the Book of Emerging Forth in the Light, a few other names. But the Book of the Dead is derived from the older Coffin Texts of the first intermediate, pardon the typo, and the Coffin Texts are derived from the even older Pyramid Texts. So just as with the King's List at Abydos, and the Turin Canon gets a little bit too much attention, I would say, at least if not put in perspective of where it comes from, the era, but the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead was almost for everyone. Now the Coffin Texts were for nobility, and the Pyramid Texts were for the pharaohs, for the kings. But that's okay. So second intermediate period, where there was no united Egypt pharaoh king, time of civil war, warlords, that type of stuff. And with the New Kingdom, then we had united Egypt once again, time of civil war, strife, turmoil, the intermediate period. Before that, what's called the Middle Kingdom. Again, there were several pharaohs, but Senusret I was an interesting one, because the oldest known surviving obelisk, which is around about 2000 BC, around about that time, is in Heliopolis, and that's has inscribed with his name and some of his victories. So Senusret also expanded the Egypt into foreign lands as well. And the founder of the New Kingdom was Mentuhotep II. Again, pardon the typo there. He died around about that time. But also that it begins with Mentu. That's the Egyptian god of war, Mentu. So whether it's Ret or Re, you'll find that other pharaohs will use Ra, Re at the end of their name. But prior to the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, where we had the first intermediate period, and again this time of strife, civil war, warlords, not a united Egypt, the kings during that time, for instance the father of Mentuhotep and his ancestors, would use the term Mentu. They would worship the god of war rather than try and connect their name through Re or Ret or Ra to the sun. The gods of the kings of that time were attaching themselves to the god of war. It was a time of civil war and strife. And okay, so Middle Kingdom, First Intermediate Period, civil war, strife, etc. And during that time, that's where we find the oldest surviving coffin texts, and that's one of the names because these texts were written on coffins, and very similar to the Book of the Dead, but these were limited to the tombs of rich people, as where now everyone focuses on the kings. Joanna Fletcher does some lovely work. She looks into the details of normal Egypt, the commoners as well, and their burial ceremonies and rituals, but coffin texts from about the First Intermediate Period. So the Book of the Dead still very relevant. So, and just like the Ptolemaic temple, still very relevant. But just to get an idea that this is already covering a 2,000-year period. Okay, so First Intermediate Period, coffin text. Then we have the Old Kingdoms, this is sometimes called the Archaic Period as well. But the Old Kingdom and Early Dynastic, or the Archaic Period, these are not very well defined. So even amongst the Egyptologists, there's still a bit of a dispute exactly what this means. These are vague terms and and the history isn't quite as clear on the records on a lot of these things. However, what we find in the Palermo Stone, we have records to the Sed festival, and we have records of Seshat and the stretching the cord ceremonies. But also the Palermo Stone, which has a king's list up to Yunus. Now Yunus was the last king mentioned. He was the first king to have the pyramid text in his tomb, and so this is from Yunus. These are the pyramid texts. Yunus now on the Palermo Stone, where we have these the late pre-dynastic kings. Now, the stone actually carries on further, so how many pre-dynastic kings there were. Now, these are not mentioned on the king's list at Abydos, they're not mentioned in the Turin canon, so that needs to be taken into account. So if you want to use those to make a case, well, okay, you need to include the Palermo Stone. But for instance, Den, what we find, well, again, you see the symbol of Seshat there, but this particular piece is the stretching the cord foundation ceremony by the Seshat priests, the great door of a temple, throne of the gods. And there are other references throughout the Palermo Stone to the stretching the cord ceremony. And it's also, so we have Dan, down here we have Kesekemwe, this is prior to Snefru, and again we see the Seshat symbol, the old, so these are from the older surviving documents. Kesekemwe, now I mentioned him earlier, but that's part of a door gem. It was repurposed later, but it was found, this stone where we see the stretching the cord ceremony. Just a comparison there. And we also, of course, have it written as well. So the depictions, whether from the Ptolemaic back to this period, are coherent. Also, so priest Weponefret, that was one of the priests of Seshat. We have a slab stela across the Western Cemetery in Giza, where all the high officials were born. Sign of the scribe and architects, and of course Seshat. So he was an overseer of the record keepers, and the scribes being the keepers of the records. And we see a comparison, Seshat. Even like in Budge, on his hieroglyph dictionary, this symbol is for Seshat, but the goddess of wisdom. So Seshat from the very old period. Now also you could bring up the Scorpion II bowl, or King Nama, which also has those references there. I mentioned them in earlier ones, but I just want here to establish firstly a timeline of the stretching the cord ceremony in Seshat, as well as just to put the Book of the Dead and the Abydos Kings lists and that into a perspective. And you see from over this 3,000-year period of well-recorded, well-established history, and the documents which are cross-referenced with, at least from the New Kingdom onward, immaculate connections to even other nations, writing each other letters, business deals, trade deals, receipts. If it was in a court of law, it would be a slam dunk. So at least up to that period. But even the Middle Kingdom and these intermediate periods, still there's it's not. We'd love to have more records, of course, but the story is quite coherent and blends itself to one another. One thing backs up the other. It's not as slapdash as what would often be said. But that's history from the Ptolemaic, stretching the cord way back to the Old Kingdom and archaic pre-dynastic period, and also the Pyramid Texts, the Coffin Texts, and then the Book of the Dead. But if certain, I'm going to cover this, and in regards to what these pyramids, not just of Unas Pepi, as well as other kings say, if you read the whole text, and I'll put some links up to that I'll get to that topic and put all the links up. Yeah, some very interesting writing, and at least raises some very interesting questions. So I just threw that, so lots of typos going on in here, but forgive me those. Anyway, a lot more to come on Seshat, and especially the stretching the cord ceremony and how it connects to these very old documents, such as the Pyramid Texts, the Palermo Stone, and these lists going back quite some time. So with that, hope you enjoyed. More to come on Seshat, and a lot more actually to come. Cheers. Series on Seshat, and with a focus on the Heb Sed festival. So also we'll be using the Palermo Stone once again, this very important old document, which includes, so there are pieces spread about. If the whole document was intact, that would be amazing, because for instance we have a king's list on there, and of the remaining piece, so up here what we have is earlier kings to the first dynasty. So not only that, Menes and Nama are listed separately, which often you'll find them said to be the same, but we also have King Scorpion, Ka, Irihor, and Scorpion the First, and that's the surviving pieces of that stone. The implication would be that there would be more going back, but so as a king's list on there, and so the Nama palette, which is usually described to say when officially civilization began in Egypt, with the unification of the upper and lower, or of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lower Egypt being northern Egypt next to the delta, Lower Egypt, and Upper Egypt being up the Nile or southern Egypt. But these are listed separately on the Nama palette. It has like King Scorpion, here we see the compared to the Nama palette. We'll look at that a little bit later. King Ka, okay, but the Palermo Stone, we see references to Seshat. The old symbol of Seshat, and there are also, so Seshat is also believed to be on King Scorpion and the Nama palette, because both of them have this 7-petal rosette, for instance there and there. It's not easy to make out, but I've done that before. But we'll be looking at the Heb Sed festival. Seshat was a goddess of accountants, the pharaoh's accountant. When he came back from war, she would count up the captured animals, etc. She also counted out the pharaoh's years and war prizes, but she also counted out the years allotted to the pharaoh. And she, very important, she was the keeper of records. For instance, scribes were the priests or priestesses of Seshat. And this symbol here, which is a palm frond, which was an ancient way of keeping count, but also a ceremonial way which carried through later. And I'll put this PDF in the... So I'll put a couple of PDFs. Firstly, one describing actually two describing the Palermo Stone, which includes the King's List on there. This one, a shorter one, but it does list the stretching the cord ceremonies, and goes into some nice little details on those. It's just a bit slow to load up at the moment. But I'll also place this one, which has the importance of palm ribs, or these palm fronds used in ceremony, especially connected to Seshat. So you can maybe see there, that symbol. There's essentially Seshat with the palm frond and that symbol connected. And it goes into some nice detail in regards to the symbolism and other gods who use this palm frond. So the measuring tool, the counting tool, those links in the description. Also, this is one of the ebony labels of King of Den running the Sed or Heb Sed festival. There you also see the palm frond, which is a symbol for 1 year as well. King Den, he's on the Palermo Stone, one of these very old kings, running the Heb Sed festival, the palm frond. palm frond to keep count of years, and it was so there we see even the palm frond symbol from Gardner representing 1 year. Variations on timekeeping. So the previous episode I mentioned the stretching the cord ceremony, and the keeper of time was there using the Merkit to align these temples as well to the north and to track the North Star movements. Many references to there, but so Seshat, which is the female equivalent of Thoth, and he's also shown with his palm frond symbol to keep count of the years. He too was timekeeping, weights and measures, architecture, writing. Even here you'll see him with the palm frond, very similar to a tally stick. So that's the symbol of a year, and there once more the ebony label of Den, just an example of a palm frond, the before, and then you strip it, and what you have is a very simple tally stick, and the simple things work the best as well. So 1 year, this is a Palermo Stone. Each of these little boxes represents 1 year. We see this palm frond symbol there. The boxes even count out and measure the Nile flood. Another very important role of Seshat and her priestesses were to count, keep measure. And the Nile flood being no more one of the most important yearly measurements to be done. So palm frond to count the years. Seshat counted out the year of the pharaoh, and every 30 years Seshat granted the king the Heb Sed festival, and then it would be repeated each 3 years after that. So for a pharaoh to get to 30 years was a very important point. Along with raising the so Heb Sed was a reenactment, firstly, of the unification of North and South Egypt, also a redo of the coronation ceremony, such as raising the Jed, but also the pharaoh, the king, would have to run around the block. So there would be a ceremonial area laid out. He would have to run around that so many times to show that he was still vigorous. If there's some suggestions that there used to be a ritual murder of the kings when they weren't able to walk or do all the important roles, and this 30-year festival of him running around the borders to represent him enclosing the borders, but also to show that he was still vigorous and strong. And there are lots of examples. It's one of the most recorded all across the length, so going back to the very ancient times. But the Heb Sed or Sed festival, also known as the Feast of the Tail, because the tail would be connected, so you see the animal tail. But it was named after Sed, who was also known as Wep-Awet. Pardon the pronunciation, if Wep-Away, Wep-Waway, or Wep-Wawet. But so the Nama palette. Okay, cool. There you go. I like that one. But anyway, King Nama, so there we see him with the crown of Upper or Southern Egypt, and there he is with the crown of Lower Egypt, and unifying the two kingdoms. I would say reunifying them, but at the very least that there were two kingdoms that would suggest civilization was already in existence. But the important feature to begin with is this part here, and we see those. Now we'll also see very similar, even though that part's missing from King Scorpion 2, very similar arrangement there, but the focus is on that portion there. And what do we see? Well, that's actually Wep-Wawet. This is from Den, Pharaoh Den. I mentioned him earlier on the Nama palette. Runs the Sed festival, just like the Nama palette, raising the mace to defeat his enemies. He also overcome the eastern tribes, but also this feature, what we see the same there as what we see there. Close up of it, and notice the snake there, because later depictions we see Wep-Wawet with the serpent once again on this sled type arrangement on top of the pole. I don't know exactly what that, but anyway. And again, another one where we see this, so similar to this more sort of blobby one with the curl, but there we see again Wep-Wawet, the snake, and the wolf. He's a war deity. His cult center was in Asyut, pardon the pronunciation. Now even that one very similar to there, but it's very easy to confuse Wep-Wawet with Anubis. They are actually separate So there we see these are depictions of Wepawet there, and this is a Anubis the jackal. He's coloured differently. Wepawet will have this silver tinge to him, this blue, in blue and silver. So that's one way to separate these two. They're often confused, but they're actually separate. Wepawet, the wolf deity, the war deity, also the opener of the ways. Some would suggest that because his connection to war is something like a scout, or attached to the front lines in that way. He's cult centered in Asiat. Asiat, in just like Hermopolis is a Greek name of Kemenu, or Heliopolis is a Greek name of Ianu. Asiat is called Lycopolis, translates to city of the wolf, Lyco, because lycanthrope is a name for a werewolf, so that's where we get the origin of lycanthrope. Back to the Nama palette. So okay, that's pretty much it. But this important festival connected to Seshat, counting out the years of a pharaoh. Accountancy, also she was the one who kept tabs of his war victory and war booties associated with the census. So these links, but now for instance in the Palermo Stone, where they are stretching the cord ceremony, you'll see the tour of Horus, where the king would travel up and down the Nile to every second year to announce himself and to assert his authority. And you'll also see there you go, smiting the Bedouin. That was like that depiction we saw earlier. Throne of the Gods, Festival of Sekar. There are also important features here is the first running of the Apis bull, what we're looking for. The time of the census. Upper and Lower Egypt, massive territory for a king or an administration. It's a sophisticated administration, bureaucracy to do a census, and there was these other, not just the population, but there was also a reference here, census of the goldsmiths, for instance. So again, it shows that this very early civilization there was already Upper and Lower Egypt, so there were already two kingdoms, and to say that it was the beginning of civilization, well, I think that's but either way, what we see, even if that is the case, that they will very quickly census of the gold, census of the goldsmiths. We see it going around the wall. Stretching the cord ceremony. So I'll put these links in the description. Palermo Stone, which has a king's list and some other interesting information there towards the end, just as a breakdown of it. And this one in regards to the palm ribs, which is an important feature symbolically in ceremonies, but especially in Seshat accounting, and whatever's connected with Seshat is connected with Thoth, gods of knowledge, wisdom, science, architecture, etc. So those links will be in the description, and there is a playlist for Seshat of all the previous episodes in this series, and all connects to Heliopolis and the Ben Stone as well in various ways. Again, we see the palm frond, Heb Sed, pavilion of Sesostris I. So this Sed festival goes back quite some time. Very, very important ritual. After 30 years especially, to get pharaohs basically wanted to get to the Sed festival. Once you completed your first Sed festival, you had a special place amongst the kings. Because of the runtime, I'm dividing this compilation of older videos into two, and I'm going to redo this part just to remove some of the rantiness from the original one, but also to keep them into two general areas. The first, we've been discussing Seshat in regards to libraries, teaching, astronomy, record keeping, and so forth. And I'll end this part, and so I want to have a look at a very, at least when it comes to YouTube and lost technology, lost civilizations, we'll look at the importance of Seshat and Thoth, but in regards to this very, again, unsexy area of record keeping and administration, or bureaucracy. Now you could imagine the most sophisticated modern technology, the factory. Is it the technology that's driving that factory, or is it the administration and the logistics that keep the factory going. Of course, you need the actual technology, but which is the most important now? Because we see the fancy robots sparking. Well, that's actually administration, bureaucracy, logistics that's really driving that. So a well-organized team with primitive technology will do a lot more than a badly organized team with modern technology. And that will be the theme of this, and that's an important feature. So Thoth, Seshat, Gods of Knowledge, Writing, Science, Record Keeping, all these themes. And again, the Seshat invented writing, Thoth taught it to the people. So she's the goddess of scribes, but of geometry, astronomy, architects, surveying, and builders. These are all the things that she's connected with in her various titles, and of course weights and measures. So along with record keeping and the logistics that go along with that in education, standardized weights and measures just so important in regards to all branches of whether it's the small market, the large market, tax keeping, land organization, distribution, and accountants as well. So, and of course the house of the books of the record keepers. So in administration, bureaucracy, or logistics, it's the business and of government for trade, census taking, taxation. These all rely on science, accounting, maths, and record keeping. Even, say, for instance, the Roman Empire was huge, but it was controlled by a small group who ran schools, universities to train bureaucrats to operate in a very particular. Of course, they had the military, but even the Roman military was not. They had a very small population to draw on, but they were able to achieve so much because they were very well organized, very well trained, and the Roman soldier was as much an engineer as he was a fighter. And so you need this multiple levels to run a civilization. What is a civilization? Well, it's really the ability to organize, and that's why this comes in so important. So I've mentioned the Palermo Stone, and of course record keeping, whether it's keeping the flood records and all that goes along with that. But think about Egypt. So now we have the Nile River, and Egypt is the Nile. And even to the later period, you had it Lower and Upper Egypt. So Lower Egypt is actually northern Egypt, but it's lower on the river. The river is running to the sea. And Upper Egypt is southern Egypt. So the famed Nama palette. So generally speaking, the accepted date when Egyptian civilization began, it began with Nama, when he unified the lower and upper kingdoms. And again, you can see that imagery with the crown of Lower Egypt and the crown of Upper Egypt, and that's why you'll see the pharaohs and that swirly bit, the red crown, Lower Egypt, the white crown, Upper Egypt. But again, that would imply that there were two kingdoms before, but at least from that beginning of that period, that's controlling a massive amount of territory. That's something like 1,000 kilometers from top to bottom. You need to be very well organized to control that, and then to do the massive works, the irrigation projects and all that goes with it. It's administration that really is the key to civilization now, civilization in the past, and any sort of large-scale building projects. Well-organized, well-trained administration and those schools of life, which were under the auspices of Seshat, that's just essential. So when it comes to Egypt, the grand monuments, of course, beautiful and amazing as they are, they dominate the talk, at least in the public sphere. Of obscure papers dealing with the more the less sexy, very well but forgotten. But important feature is for the actual, there's a lot of Egypt, the mainstream academic Egyptologists, but what are they actually doing? And what are they looking into? Well, it's the small details, the daily details and lives of the average Egyptian that counts. We focus on the kings and the high administration, but what about the average ancient Egyptian? There's a series called Immortal Egypt. If you know, that's a great watch because it goes through the history of Egypt from the oldest to up until the Ptolemaic period, and it's presented by Joanne Fletcher. And in that series, she talks about it, but also in these larger works, you know, which don't sort of find too much airtime or linkage. Egyptologists such as her, and actually the bulk of them, they're not just all crowded around the pyramids. They're investigating the minutiae, the small details of the everyday Egyptian, which are overlooked, generally speaking. So, for instance, just south of the Wall of the Crow, there is a housing for workers there. Their tools, all their small, all the items connected to them can be found there. There are lots of tools found on the Giza Plateau, but one of the things that people such as her were doing at that location was looking at the dormitories, counting fish and beef bones to get a good idea of how much food was being brought in. Therefore, we know how many workers were there. And that's a thing about administration, but also, how did the ancient Egyptians make their clothes? Well, again, there's quite a bit of information in regards to that. Questions like, how did they make their rope? And how did the ancient Egyptians make their homes? Now, at this point, I think it's especially they talk about the megalithic age. Well, that's sort of made up. There's no, what is the megalithic age? But Sarah Parkhack as well. She's a historian, and she uses satellite data to look underground, and recent finds, next to even including a new pyramid being discovered, was that there was these cities connected to them where the actual people lived, large cities, and for the most part they were making their homes from mud brick and these type of materials. What you won't find is when they speak of, again, the megalithic age, there are no megalithic homes. We find giant megalithic stone walls and these type of features, but there were no homes. Where were the builders living? They were, these structures are not for living in. They're typically, as a general rule, houses of stone are houses for the dead. So, for instance, in the Etruscans and the Romans and Mesopotamians and all these other people, where they were building with stone was generally either a temple or cities of the dead. Their actual homes themselves were made of timber or mud brick or these such materials. But these small details of how the ancient Egyptians lived was a very important one, the average person. And again, just as a general rule, there's a cool saying I heard a while ago, and before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. In that, small details count. And that's an important feature, I think, in regards to the, what are the actual Egyptologists, archaeologists doing? Well, they're looking into those small details. So, if we get a much better view of Egyptian life by looking at their bureaucracy, their administration, and their everyday minutiae. You can't understand the big feature if you don't understand the small features. So counting fish bones, this is so important, but quackademic sort of thing. But the important feature, back to Seshat, bureaucracy, schools, record keeping. For instance, Napoleon, amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics. Sun Tzu, the line between disorder and order lies in logistics. It's organization that drives a civilization, but any grand, big project. If you can get your organization, your logistics in order, then you can achieve almost anything. You can have the best technology, and if you're not well organized and your logistics are not working, then you don't have anything. So it's the administration, the bureaucracy, the boring details that are actually so important. That's what makes Seshat and Thoth so important, is the ability to organize. That's record keeping, organization is the the foundations of a civilization. So it was, once you understand how much food is being produced, you get an idea of the population. That tells you how many people were available for the great works, how many work, not everyone could be at the farm. Once you get well organized, the more and more percentage of your population is not required to be working on the farm all the time, and they can be put into large-scale public works. We can also, by studying, for instance, ancient Egyptian mines, looking at the furnaces and the slag heaps, have been able to calculate how much copper was being produced, let alone there were records, but they were able to produce large amounts of copper, gold, silver, and those type of things. And then also through the surviving record, but also through the written records, we get an idea of how much trade. So how much were they exporting? How much were they importing? Again, this gives us an idea of the sophistication of the economy, of what resources were available, and it gets a much better picture of what's going on. So whether it's the oldest writings, such as in Sumer, inventories, lists of goods. What drives writing? Is it people invented writing to write down religious stories? Was probably actually writing was driven by the need by merchants, bureaucracy, administration to keep records. And then a bonus from that was because your stories, the myths and the stories, they're already being transported through time orally. What you cannot do through the oral tradition is keep accurate records over time. So astronomical records, business records, tax records, land records, that requires writing. And so amongst the oldest writings in Mesopotamia, but also Egypt, are tax records. Now, in regards to sophistication as well, there's the Diary of Merah. He was a leader, an inspector who ran a work crew. He was transporting Tura limestone from the east bank of the Nile over to the Giza Plateau and the large-scale building projects there. But what's interesting about that document as well, it's written almost as a business report. It's not just like him writing home, or today I did this. It's keeping records. This is what we did today. This is what I stayed here this night. The next day we moved over there, and we brought this many boats and this many workers to move stones over to here. So it's much more official and like a record keeping than it is one of just purely telling, writing home and saying, oh, today, we did this. I had dinner with my friends. We saw a lovely garden. No, it's very well ordered. Again, it's pointing to administration, record keeping, taxation. So the big questions of, if you're not really looking at the details of what were the average person doing, how were they arranging themselves, what kind of administration, bureaucracy, schools did they have, then questions such as a pyramid, how was it built, can't really be asked, because it's not the technology that's driving it. The pyramids are essentially a pile of limestone rubble with a smooth casing on the outside. But it does require massive amounts of, skilled architects, as Seshat was a goddess there, but also administration. So when it comes to questions such as the ancient Egyptian economy, administration, and so forth, again, these are essential elements to try and understand before to go to any ancient aliens types of level, because it's without examining bureaucracy, administration, economy, mathematics, accountancy, then all those other questions shouldn't even really begin to be asked, and then looking further, because with primitive technology and an excellent administration, you can achieve huge amounts. With advanced technology and a pathetic administration, you can't achieve anything. So these elements need to be examined, and there is a strong narrative amongst the alternative at YouTube when it comes to ancient Egypt. essentially say that there's nothing known about these or to diminish ancient Egyptians, and has a very large YouTuber just recently called them towel-wearing, didn't use the word primitives, but it was, these people wearing towels pushing stones. And he's asking for large amounts of money to go on a tour. But, so without looking at this first, okay, as a joke, but a recent, that same YouTuber indicated that the hieroglyph for a water jar pouring out water, which relates to purification, well, there's a USB port and there's laptops, so SD card, yeah. But let's seriously, and if you're, for those really interested, if they're not asking these questions, how can they be presenting themselves as some sort of authority who can ask people large amounts of money to go on tours to promote lost ancient high technology? Advanced machine tools. Administration, these really, unsexy, boring things are the bread and butter that, without asking that and without looking into that, you might as well go completely blind. So whether another ancient civilization, Rome, and the story of Jesus' birth, Joseph had to travel to his town of birth to participate in the census, and that's still now so important. Again, another one of these elements of a civilization and an administration that's very well organized. The Palermo Stone, which lists the earliest kings, even some before Nama, keeps a yearly detailed record of the Nile flood. Also lists, like the Seb festival and these other features, but amongst it also registers the census being taken, but also a special census just for the goldsmiths. So this, towel wearing, these primitives who couldn't do anything, were, they were sophisticated enough over this large kingdom, to have to even take account of specialist trades. So accountancy, bureaucracy, it's all very unsexy, it's easy to point at the pyramid and, go all ancient aliens, but there is a lot known. Again, it's just push it. There's nothing there, but there is quite a bit in there. But it just involves reading boring papers and counting fish bones and slag piles at mines and looking at the actual record. So Seshat, accountancy, weights and measures. These are all surveying. These are the things that are just so important, essential in a civilization, and the small questions need to be asked before even thinking about going into the big ones. But that's why Seshat's so important. I've broken this compilation up into two pieces, and I've added this bit at the end. The next parts I'll be looking at the stretching the cord ceremony and archaeoastronomy and other features which are very strongly related to Seshat and temple building as well. So that'll be in the next part, and looking at the alignments of the pyramids to the north, which is a common feature, but also other astronomical alignments such as to the solstice. And with that, that's the end of this particular piece. And the next one I'll go. I'm alternative, but I'm not ancient aliens alternative. And so here's the more mundane part, and again based on the records. There's quite a bit in there, and again I think they do a great disservice to our collective history, these types of things, and I understand that they have a business to run, but you don't, you can sell good products and still be profitable. But with that, hope you enjoyed this part, and the next one will be more on, again, the archaeoastronomy and more curious elements of Seshat, especially in relation to heliopolis and various alignments with the pyramids and temples there. with that, hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.